Okay. Hopefully everybody is back. I'm thrilled that the next speaker will be Natalie Gutierrez talking about her experience at ZNE New England and their Grassroots Wildlife Conservation Group. And the title is Examining the Effect of Conservation Interventions for Blending Turtles in Massachusetts. Natalie?
Thanks, Dr. Rotberg. Hi, everyone. For those that don't know me, my name is Natalie Gutierrez, and I was fortunate enough to intern with ZNE New England's Grassroots Wildlife Conservation this summer. In my presentation today, I'll be discussing what I did with GWC, both at home and in the field as well, mainly relating to head starting and monitoring programs involving Blanding's turtles, which are both rare and listed as threatened here in Massachusetts. So Grassroots Wildlife Conservation is a nonprofit organization that is part of ZNE New England, and their main goal is to preserve rare and declining species and biodiversity here in Massachusetts. GWC believes that conservation begins at home and that engaging the public through education and hands-on experience will create lasting wildlife conservation. The best way to ensure conservation is to have caring and educated neighbors, and they'll be aware of and make efforts to protect the rare and endangered species in their yards. GWC launched a turtle head starting program called Hatchling and Turtle Conservation through Head Starting, or HATCH, which is very clever, where students and teachers from participating schools can be actively involved in captive rearing of turtles. Through this program, students can learn that they can be stewards of protecting native biodiversity. In this next slide here, I'm going to be showing a couple of different turtles that GWC works with. So the first is snapping turtles, and this is a very angry female snapping turtle. Spotted turtles, box turtles, wood turtles, and Blanding's turtles, which is mainly what I worked with this summer. You can easily recognize a Blanding's turtle by their bright yellow throat and chin, but you'll rarely ever see them in the wild just because they are very elusive and very few in numbers. I know that I also mentioned head starting before, but never went into what it actually is. So it's essentially the captive rearing of wild hatchlings that will hopefully increase the likelihood of adult survivorship, and in turn create a more robust population. Head starting programs are usually using Blanding's hatchlings, but GWC has also used other species to head start as well. The way that we're able to obtain hatchlings was through radio tracking females during nesting season, which is May through June. And these females were caught at an earlier date and had radio transmitters placed onto their carapaces. So if I go back a slide, you'll see the spotted turtle right here has a radio transmitter placed on the carapace, and the carapace is just another word for shell. So once we were able to establish where the nest was laid, a wire mesh is placed on top of it with anchors to keep it in place and to keep predators from digging it up. The nest had to be watered in order to keep the eggs dry, to keep them moist and not dry out. The nest, once it got closer to hatching season, we also placed these nest cages on top of the nest, which is shown in this picture here. They had large sponges placed in them, and at this point they were watered pretty much every day to keep them moist, just in case hatchlings decided to pop up pretty early, and some of them did. Once hatchlings started to emerge, I believe that 2 turtles are given to participating classrooms, but unfortunately that won't be the case this year due to the pandemic. Normally, hatchlings would be kept in classrooms for 9 months and then released back into the wild. The goal of head starting programs has been to maintain adult populations and encourage the additions of these new, young, head started turtles into existing populations. Along with monitoring tracked turtles, head starting program is a long-term conservation program. And this right picture right here just shows a bunch of small hatchlings, and you'll be able to see the exit hole that they came out of when they emerged from the ground. I thought that it was worth noting the different conservation projects that GWC has also been involved with, because they don't only focus their efforts on turtles. So spadefoot toad head starting was done to restore the rarest frog in Massachusetts, which is this frog over here. As a result of this, 9 new breeding sites and 2 wildlife sanctuaries were created for spadefoot toads. Another project involved research being conducted on bridal shiners, which is a rare fish in Massachusetts, to determine how they survived in heavily urbanized streams. Another project is buttonbush planting, which GWC has been involved with, and buttonbush provides much needed cover and dense roots that turtles like to thrive in. And the last project that I'm going to mention is the Blandings Turtle Monitoring Program, which is what I spent most of my time partaking in. So I spent the beginning of my externship from home, and in that time I created turtle quizzes for the GWC staff to test their turtle aging accuracy. And the most common method to age a turtle is to count the annular growth rings on the turtle's plastron, which is the bottom of the turtle, as shown in this picture here. For each year of growth, turtles should have a visible growth line appear in their scutes, which are these are basically scutes right here, these individual parts of the plastron. As the turtle ages, it gets more and more difficult, and there can also be a lot of faux growth lines. So testing turtle aging accuracy was pretty interesting to see from the staff. So for the quiz, I showed a picture of the head started turtle's plastron, like the one here, and said what date the picture was taken and asked which year they thought the turtle was hatched. I looked at the responses and determined how far off the guesses were from the actual answer. If the respondent got the answer right, then that's great. But if they didn't and they were off by a couple years, then that's okay too, because we were just trying to determine how close they could actually get to the hatched year. If the answer was off by 9 years, then that's a little bit of a problem, and that person might want to reevaluate how they look at annular growth lines. I redistributed a second quiz using different pictures and prompted the same questions in the same way, and accuracy was actually shown to improve with this second redistribution, which was the main goal of this little project. The second part of my at-home work was to collect 4 different measurements, which is shown in this picture here. So the first measurement that I collected was the plastron length down in the middle, the diagonal length of the plastron. This is the abdominal scute, so I took the diagonal of the abdominal scute and the vertical of the abdominal scute. So I actually digitally measured these measurements on my computer, which was also a learning curve. The main goal was to find out if there could be an equation created from linear regression that could be used to determine hatchling plastron length. So after conducting multiple linear regressions with the collected data, it was determined that using the plastron length measurement, so this middle line measurement right here, and the vertical scute measurement right here actually gave the best linear relationship. So the output of that relationship is right here, and an equation was taken from that output and used to determine hatchling plastron length. So the only measurement that you would need to plug into the equation would be the vertical scute measurement. The calculated results using the equation were then compared to the actual recorded plastron length when the turtle was a hatchling. And I'll get more into those results once I touch upon my research paper, because I mentioned that a lot throughout my paper. So the portion of fieldwork for my externship consisted of assisting with tracking turtles, collecting data from the turtle, and pit tagging the turtles if needed. We tracked turtles using radio telemetry equipment as shown in this picture here. And the next couple of pictures I'm going to show are the type of environment that you would find Blandings turtles in the Great Meadows region in Concord, Massachusetts. So this is American Lotus right here with some great mud that we had to slosh through pretty often, and a lot of cattails that were pretty thick to walk through. So this is usually where we would find the turtles, out in a lotus field. And in this last picture here, there is actually a turtle, and she might not be that easily pointed out, but if you look at this little part right here, you can see a head poking out from the water. And unfortunately, whenever we were tracking them, they weren't always poking their head out. They usually never were because they didn't want to be caught. So we had to stick our hands in mud or water and kind of feel around for something that felt like a shell, pull up the turtle, and then take our data and send them on their way. And the rest of my field externship consisted of monitoring and watering protected turtle nests, like I mentioned earlier. And this next slide is just a whole bunch of pictures of hatchlings that I did find when I was doing those nest checks. And this bottom picture here is an exit hole that the turtles emerged from when they hatched. And this top middle picture here is of a nest that was actually in a difficult spot, and we couldn't place a cage around the nest. So we actually dug them up, and Emily, who is the program manager, incubated them at her house. And the rest are just of cute, small baby hatchlings. And these are all Blandings hatchlings. So the research paper that I wrote touched on the unfortunate situation that Blandings turtles are in, why they're important, and the work that GWC has been doing to increase Blandings populations. Declining populations are due to habitat fragmentation, climate change, and vehicle-related mortalities. Blandings are one species that interacts with several other species because of their position on the food chain as herbivores, carnivores, or omnivores. Turtles also have the ability to amplify environmental signals, and their health is often a reflection of the health of the environment. The rest of my paper discusses the plastron data analysis, like I mentioned before, and the results are shown here in this table. So as you can see, the delta, or the difference between the calculated and the actual plastron length, they weren't too far off, which was a great start. And this equation can be used to determine a wild hatchling's size. So usually when GWC finds a wild turtle, they're 20 plus or 30 plus years. They rarely ever find them when they're hatchlings. So they never really know how big they start off. And to be able to compare a wild turtle size to a head started turtle size is something for the future, and it would be definitely something interesting to look at using this equation. So for example, taking scute length of a turtle to the third annular growth line will give the turtle's plastron at that age. That's why taking the 0 annulus, as shown in this picture here again, and this isn't the abdominal scute, but I thought that the 0 annulus was a little bit more clear in this picture. If you take that measurement and plug it into the equation, it'll give you the hatchling size of this turtle. So ultimately, I found this externship to be extremely fulfilling, and it was definitely humbling to go out into the field and see how much work is being put into conserving different species. It's been great to see the work come to fruition with successful nest protection, head starting, and hopefully adult survival, since this is a long-term project. It's been really inspiring to work alongside so many knowledgeable and compassionate people that have always made an effort to answer the public's questions whenever we were out doing field work, and they often did because they had no idea what radio telemetry equipment was, and they often thought it was a tire pump or something of that sort. So ideally, I would love to work at an organization that has the same beliefs and impact as GWC, and I would like to see myself in a position to help inform the public about species that may go unnoticed and be able to help preserve biodiversity. And I would like to thank Dr. Rutberg for being an outstanding professor and mentor, the entire faculty and staff of the MAPP program, Dr. Windmiller and Kara McElroy for being great site mentors, and the rest of the GWC staff who taught me new things each day and making this externship as fulfilling as possible. I'm truly grateful to have had this amazing experience. Thanks.
Thank you, Natalie. We have some time for questions.
Natalie, I have a question. So as you know, yourself and many of us in the MAPP community have sort of complicated feelings about zoos. So I was wondering if getting to know this conservation program kind of literally from the ground up, if it affected your personal feelings towards zoos and kind of their role in conservation.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So Dr. Windmiller and I had actually had a brief discussion about zoos. And I think the ultimate end result of our discussion was that we were still both unsure how we felt about zoos. I think it really depends on what the zoo is doing to contribute to the species that they are protecting, and not just keeping them kind of like recycling animals that are just not really needing to be there. I think having zoos for the purpose of conserving endangered or rare species is great, but animals that aren't really having trouble in the wild producing, or having a hard time having successful population numbers, I don't really think have a place in the zoo. But I think it really depends. If you look at different organizations and different zoos, I'm sure they all do it differently. So I guess my end result is that I'm still unsure.
Fair enough.
Okay, we have a question from Dr. Lee Parrots as well. He starts with fascinating, thanks. Could you briefly outline how the hatchlings are raised in schools and the success rate?
So I think research is still being done on the success rate, just because it is a long-term project and there's still data being collected for the success rate. But I know that there's a large, complicated Google spreadsheet that has all the data. It's a little difficult to sift through. It hasn't been compiled into any numbers, unfortunately, but I think it would be very interesting to look at. As for how the hatchlings are raised, there's actually a manual that's pretty easily found online if you look up Hatch, which is the program that I mentioned earlier, manual, and it'll kind of, they wrote a manual for the teachers, but it's also available online, so they give all the equipment that's needed for the turtles, the food, and basically their care needs throughout the process of the 9 months of keeping them.
Sounds like there's a future summer externship there, if anyone is interested.
I have a question. I thought it was interesting how to find turtles, you have to go into the mud and feel for the turtles. I'm wondering, I know you didn't work with them as much, but snapping turtles, as we saw, can get angry and can really cause damage. So how do you know if they do the same method? I would think that that wouldn't work for snapping turtles.
So I learned that snapping turtles, they actually won't attack you in the water. If you're just walking around, they feel more threatened on land. So there's actually a method to grabbing snapping turtles, which is grabbing both of their back legs and, trying not to get your hands in the reach of their necks, because they can extend pretty long. The way that we were able to catch our snapping turtles was at the Arnold Arboretum, which is in Boston. It's a new project this year, and we set up turtle traps in each of these little ponds that they have there. And in the bigger pond, there's actually quite a few snapping turtles. So that picture that I showed was one of the snapping turtles that we caught. And she was very feisty. She was not happy. Matt, who actually was the one that was grabbing her out of the net, it took about, I think, 10 minutes of detangling her and trying not to get bit at the same time to get her out of the net. So it's just a lot of being careful, I think, for snapping turtles, and just being aware of where your hands are and where their mouths are as well. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't know that they were not as ready to attack underwater. So that's a cool fun fact.
Definitely good to know.
Any other questions? Okay, from Mary. Nice job. Where in Massachusetts are blanding turtles found?
So the project sites that we worked at were mostly in Concord, in Great Meadows region, but then there's also Borderlands, which is a little bit south, I believe in Sharon, Massachusetts. Wild populations, I'm not sure about where they're ranging from, but I know that they do tend to travel. So hopefully new wild populations will start popping up in Massachusetts. But as of right now, most of our efforts are in northern, north middle Massachusetts, I guess.
Yeah, they have an odd distribution. So they have sort of a population in Massachusetts that's kind of isolated, and then another one in the Midwest and Ohio and nearby. So, which is a little bit more extensive.
Right.
So there's an interesting story there, I'm sure. Okay, thank you, Natalie. All right,